A millionaire CEO, lost in his own world of wealth and privilege, stood frozen as a boy, and Orphan looked him dead in the eye and said, "I can make your daughter walk again." The boy wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't asking for pity. He was offering a miracle. But was it too good to be true? And why did he choose now to speak up if this story speaks to you, and you've ever believed that sometimes the most unexpected people hold the power to change lives? Consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it. Your support helps us tell these stories that truly matter. Jonathan Hale stood at the heart of Union Civic Plaza in Denver, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the flagstone. He wore a charcoal gray suit that once announced authority, but now felt like armor weighed down by grief. His daughter Ellie sat in a motorized wheelchair beside him, pale and still, her eyes fixed on the bronze fountain at the center of the square. Water droplets hung frozen in midair, like a promise halted before fulfillment. Jonathan's hands trembled at his sides as he watched hospital staff shuffle past, whispering that no more treatments remained. A cluster of onlookers formed behind the velvet ropes, their murmurs rising like uneasy currents. Wealthy donors in silk scarves shook their heads. Journalists with microphones exchanged skeptical glances. In that moment, Jonathan felt the full weight of his fortune useless against the paralysis that had stolen his little girl's laughter. Then a barefoot boy appeared at the edge of the gathering, stepping from the sunlit pavement as though he belonged to a different world. He wore ragged jeans and a faded sweatshirt, sleeves frayed at the cuffs. Dirt darkened the skin on his knees and toes. His frame was small, no older than 10, but something in his posture held a quiet confidence. He came to a stop a few feet from Ellie's wheelchair and tilted his head, as if listening for an answer she could not yet voice. Jonathan's jaw clenched when the boy drew a breath and spoke with a voice calm enough to hush the crowd. "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." A ripple of laughter spread through the spectators, dismissive, unkind. Ellie's head rocked at the sound, her pale cheeks flushing. The boy did not flinch. He lifted his chin and repeated, "I know exactly how to help her." Something in that declaration shifted the moment. The laughter died. Questions sparked in the journalists' lenses. A hush fell over Union Civic Plaza. Ellie blinked, and her eyes met the boy's for the first time. There was no pity in his gaze, only a recognition that something was broken and needed repair. Jonathan felt a pull in his chest, equal parts fear and curiosity. He stepped forward. His polished shoes clicked on the stone. He tried to speak, but found only tight breaths. The boy, whose name a volunteer later told him was Luca Bennett, dipped into a slight bow, then placed a gloved hand over his heart. "Please," Luca said, voice steady. "I promise to work with her strength, not against it. Just trust me." Jonathan caught Ellie's gaze. Her lips quivered, and she whispered, "Dad." Every instinct told Jonathan to protect his daughter from further disappointment, yet he saw something in Ellie's eyes he had not seen since the accident, a faint spark of hope. He swallowed hard and knelt beside her wheelchair. Ellie's breath hitched as he laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He turned to Luca. "If you fail, you leave her alone." Luca nodded without hesitation. Ellie's slight nod followed. In that silent accord, Jonathan made a decision that astonished even himself. He would grant this barefoot stranger a chance. As Luca extended his hand to Ellie, offering her a place to rest her unsteady fingers, Jonathan sensed the eyes of Denver upon him, some judging, some rooting. He squared his shoulders. He would stand by his daughter. He would stand by this boy. And as the crowd held its breath, Ellie leaned forward and placed her hand in Luca's. Her grip was tentative, yet firm enough to send a quiver through the young healer's arm. The fountain's water finally arced forward, droplets catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Luca looked up at Jonathan, eyes steady. "We begin tomorrow at dawn." Jonathan nodded, hope and fear warring in his chest. As the last light of day faded from Union Civic Plaza, late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Hale family's brownstone on East 6th Avenue in Denver. The air inside Jonathan Hale's mahogany-lined study felt heavy with unspoken regret. He stood by the window, gaze fixed on Ellipse Park's swaying birch trees, and replayed the boy's steady promise echoing in his mind. His reflection in the glass looked older than his 50 years. Grief etched around his eyes. A text blinked on his phone, a reminder from his chief of staff to confirm Ellie's private consultation at Denver General Hospital. Jonathan hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, unwilling to commit further until he knew more about Luca Bennett's bold claim. Across town, on a cracked sidewalk outside Denver Children's Home, Luca Bennett pressed his back against a weathered brick wall that had seen better days. He unfolded a tattered scrapbook, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. Among faded photographs of a white delivery truck and a laughing family picnic, his finger traced the image of his parents smiling in front of that same truck. His chest tightened at the memory of the crash that had changed everything. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling sharply to steady himself. Then he opened them, toes curled into the rough concrete, and reminded himself why he had spoken those words at Union Civic Plaza. Ellie needed him as much as he needed purpose. Back at Blake Enterprises HQ on 15th Street, Jonathan slid into a leather chair behind his glass desk, surrounded by awards and framed articles about his business success. He opened Ellie's medical file, scrolling through MRI scans and surgical reports. Each image showed unresponsive nerves and atrophied muscles. No note, no procedure, no surgeon's hope suggested that Ellie could ever walk again. He tapped his pen against the desktop, unsettled by the void of answers. Then he read the text from Ellie again. "Dad, I want to try." The simple words carried a tremor of hope Jonathan hadn't felt in months. He shut the laptop and stood, pacing between shelves of leather-bound law volumes and company ledgers. He tried to recall any alternative therapies that might explain Luca's confidence, but his corporate world offered no clue. A call from his attorney blinked on the phone screen. Legal counsel, warning him against impulsive actions that could expose Hale Freight to liability. Jonathan silenced the ringtone and watched the skyline of Denver recede into dusk beyond the glass. Meanwhile, Luca walked away from the children's home, each step stirring memories of broken glass and twisted metal. He remembered the moment he had crawled from the wreckage, blood heavy on his palms, and how he had vowed that no one else would suffer in silence. When he arrived at his small apartment under the Baker Street overpass, he spread the scrapbook on a scuffed table and lit a single lamp. He reviewed the photographs again, breathing deeply to quiet the ache in his chest. Then he reached for a worn journal and began to write detailed notes about muscle groups and visualization exercises, concepts he had gleaned from library books and online videos stolen from open networks. His hand moved swiftly, fueled by resolve. Late that night, Jonathan stood alone in the dim glow of his study lamp. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, Ellie at her 5th birthday, eyes bright with mischief. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'll do whatever it takes." He reopened them and picked up his phone. His thumb trembled as he tapped out a message, "Schedule private session with Dr. Martinez at Denver General, 7 tomorrow." He pressed send and placed the phone back on the desk, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. In the pre-dawn hours, Denver's streets lay silent under a blanket of fog. A single street lamp flickered outside the pediatric therapy wing as Jonathan unlocked the door for Luca's first formal session. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, sterile and bright. He led Luca down the corridor to room 312, where Ellie waited, sheets of hope and trepidation rustling between them. Luca drew a steady breath and faced Jonathan for the first time without the window between them. Jonathan met the boy's gaze and saw only determination. He swallowed hard, remembering the scrapbook's faded images, the attorney's warnings, and his daughter's whispered plea. And then the boy spoke quietly, as if to himself. "I've been preparing for this." Jonathan nodded, stepping aside to let Luca pass. Ellie's wheelchair hummed forward to meet the boy who would shape the next chapter of their lives. He watched Luca extend his hand, not in charity, but in partnership, and he realized that the past would not remain buried. The shadows across his family history had begun to stir, demanding to be faced 2 days after their encounter at Union Civic Plaza. Jonathan Hale guided Luca Bennett through the automatic sliding doors of Denver General Hospital's pediatric therapy wing. The corridor stretched ahead in muted pastels, walls painted a gentle seafoam green. Edvard Munch prints hung in simple frames, and soft light filtered down from panels above. The faint tang of antiseptic mingled with the hope that clung to every corner of the hospital. Luca walked barefoot on the linoleum floor, toes splaying as he passed the reception desk. His jeans were cuffed at the ankle, the fabric worn at the knees. A nurse paused behind her station to watch him, eyebrows raised. Jonathan, in contrast, wore polished loafers and a tailored jacket that somehow felt out of place here. He offered Luca's shoulder a steadying hand, though he himself felt unsteady. They reached room 312, marked with a colorful sticker of a red balloon flying over clouds. Inside, Ellie sat upright on a specialized bench, her legs secured in support frames. She wore soft sweatpants under a light hospital gown, and her expression flickered between determination and uncertainty. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her eyes, once dull with resignation, glimmered now as she watched Luca enter. Jonathan stood just outside the glass observation window, arms crossed. He had overseen countless boardroom negotiations and press conferences, but nothing tested his resolve like this moment. He watched Luca kneel before Ellie, meeting the head physical therapist, Marisol Vega, squarely in the eye. "This is unorthodox," Marisol said softly, folding her arms. Her tone carried more curiosity than condemnation, but the edge of skepticism remained. She had 11 years of clinical training behind her and had seen many well-meaning but misguided interventions. Luca didn't shrink back. He looked at Marisol, then at Ellie. "Please," he said quietly, voice steady. "Trust me." Ellie's hand tightened on the bench handle, and she glanced at Jonathan through the glass. He nodded once, barely perceptible, a silent accord that granted Luca permission. Luca removed his jacket and draped it over an empty chair beside the bench. Underneath, he wore a plain white t-shirt, slightly faded. He unfolded a torn cloth map on his lap, edges frayed, symbols drawn in crayon and ink. Arrows pointed to labeled areas: tibia, femur, quadriceps. Luca had drawn them by studying anatomy books in the public library, and each line represented a step in his plan. He placed one hand gently on Ellie's ankle and guided her foot through an imagined arc. "Breathe. Think of the floor as your friend," he said, voice low and even. His fingers traced the outline of her sole, as if drawing a path back to strength. Ellie's brow furrowed with concentration. She exhaled sharply and attempted to flex her toes. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Ellie's toes twitched. Marisol's breath caught, and she exchanged a glance with an assistant behind her. The assistant, a young therapist named Carla, stepped forward, eyes bright. "She's responding," Carla murmured. Ellie turned her head to Luca, voice barely audible. "I felt something." Her lips trembled in the slightest smile, an echo of the hope he had first sparked in the plaza. Jonathan pressed his forehead against the glass, heart pounding. He had believed in data and credentials, not barefoot intuition. He felt Marisol's gaze on his reflection, her posture softening. Then, as Ellie tried a second flex, a small hiccup of pain crossed her face. She bit her lip, and her eyes fluttered shut. Luca withdrew his hand gently and leaned closer. "If it hurts, we pause," he said. He sounded calm, compassionate, like a teacher tending a wounded bird. Ellie opened her eyes and nodded, tears threatening. Luca patted her shoulder, and she took a shaky breath. Marisol stepped around to the front of the bench, adjusting her clipboard. She spoke in a measured tone. "We need to monitor for inflammation. If she overdoes it, we risk a setback." Luca's jaw tightened. He glanced at Ellie, whose chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "I understand," he said. He drew in a deep breath and looked at Jonathan, who was still pressed to the glass. Luca's gaze held a question. Was he ready to trust this unorthodox plan when so much was at stake? Jonathan lifted a hand and offered a firm nod. Luca resumed the exercise, guiding Ellie's foot again in slower, more deliberate arcs. Ellie's expression shifted from fear to fierce concentration. The room felt suspended in anticipation until, finally, she flexed her ankle fully, and a soft gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, Jonathan saw tears of joy rather than grief. The assistant therapist, Carla, reached for her phone and tapped a quick note in Ellie's file, first voluntary muscle response since surgery. Marisol clucked her tongue and cleared her throat, stepping back to let Luca and Ellie share the moment. As Jonathan exhaled in relief, his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He withdrew it discreetly and glanced at the screen. A notification from corporate security flashed, "Review file Bennett family accident." His chest tightened as a cold reminder of Luca's past threatened the warmth of this breakthrough. Jonathan slipped the phone back and met Luca's eyes across the glass. Luca's own expression flickered pride mixed with a shadow of pain. Ellie, oblivious to the looming reminder, reached for Luca's hand again, her grip gentle but insistent. The moment held tenderness and tension in delicate balance, as though the past and future converged in that small therapy room. Jonathan watched, knowing that whatever came next would test not only Ellie's body, but all of their hearts. That evening, Jonathan Hale sat alone in his Crestwood Manor study, the soft glow of Denver's city lights filtering through gauzy curtains. He leaned over his polished oak desk, where stacks of legal folders and classified memos piled like monuments to secrecy. He opened the first envelope bearing his name in crisp, embossed lettering. Inside lay witness statements from the 2019 accident that left his daughter Ellie paralyzed. He scanned the lines, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, the angle of the delivery truck, the teenager trapped under twisted metal. His breath hitched as he recognized the signature at the bottom of one statement, Luca Bennett's father, Daniel Bennett. Jonathan's chest tightened. He reached for the next stack invoices marked Hale Freight Incident Confidential Settlement, each signed by his personal counsel. He flipped through internal emails directing regional managers to offer hush money and silence any talk of company liability. One message, from 6 months before the crash, instructed drivers to route around elementary schools, citing excessive pedestrian traffic, a line Jonathan had approved without thought. Now the words felt like knives carving open his conscience. Jonathan closed his eyes, recalling Luca's earnest face in the therapy room, the boy's bare feet on the linoleum, the steady tilt of his head when he spoke of helping Ellie walk. All that conviction sprang from bones and tissue, tangled by Jonathan's choices. Guilt bloomed like a dark flower in his chest. He reached out and closed the folders, heart pounding, until the VHS-sized tapes of surveillance footage seemed to mock him from beneath the paper pile. He had tried to erase this history, but now it pulsed beneath the surface. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email to his attorney at St. George and Miller. The cursor blinked above the subject line, "Unauthorized therapy sessions." He typed a curt instruction block, Bennett from hospital grounds. He paused, fingers hovering. Ellie's soft voice echoed in his mind. "I felt something." He remembered how her toes flexed under Luca's guidance, how the physical therapist's gasp had filled the room with hope. Could he condemn his daughter to despair? Because of his own shame, Jonathan deleted the email body. Instead, he drafted a single line, "Meet me tomorrow, Ada, at Union Civic Plaza." He hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. Inviting Luca back meant exposing the crash's full history and risking a media firestorm. Yet denying that same boy could deny Ellie her chance at recovery. He exhaled and hit send. His phone vibrated with a breaking news alert. Protesters had gathered at the plaza, demanding justice for wage theft at local freight companies. Wealth disparity placards bobbed in a sea of faces. Jonathan stared at the headline "Freight Workers Rally" as Millionaire's daughter seeks unlikely healer. He closed the news app, heart racing. The gathering threatened to ignite into chaos the moment Luca appeared. At 20 minutes after midnight, Jonathan paced the length of his parquet-floored hallway. A portrait of his father in military uniform hung above the sideboard. He recalled the older man's stern voice at home, teaching that reputation was all. He pressed his palm to the frame, as though pleading for guidance. But this crisis demanded more than reputation. It demanded integrity. He found himself drawn to Ellie's bedroom door, half ajar. Inside, his daughter lay asleep in her wheelchair, head reclined against a plush pillow. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. In the lamplight, she looked peaceful, unaware of the storm he was about to unleash on their lives. He whispered, "I'm sorry for keeping you part of this secret." He touched her cold hand, feeling its slight tremor. "Tomorrow, we face it together." Outside, a thunderstorm rolled in over the Rocky Mountains. Rain tapped against stained glass window panes like restless fingers. Jonathan rose and walked back to his study. He gathered the envelopes, sorted the memos, and placed them in a secure briefcase. Under the briefcase, he tucked the invitation to the plaza. He paused, fingers on the latch, and allowed himself a moment of silent resolve. He would stand by Luca and Ellie at dawn, come what may. He turned off the desk lamp and stepped into the hallway. The house was still, its corridors echoing with memories of laughter and loss. As he reached the front door and retrieved his raincoat, a final hush descended. The scent of wet pine drifted through the open hallway window. He closed the door behind him, stepping into the night with a singular purpose. Tomorrow, he would return not as a man hiding secrets, but as a father seeking redemption. The rain would wash away the silence he had buried, leaving only the truth beneath late afternoon sunlight slanted through the therapy room windows at Denver General, illuminating Luca Bennett's mop of dark curls as he unfolded a ragged photograph. He held it with careful fingers, the edges worn from years of folding and unfolding. Ellie Hale leaned forward, breath catching, as Luca traced a slender finger over the image of a white delivery truck, its paint chipped and rusty in places. In the photo, a younger Luca stood between his parents at a summer fair, his mother's arm draped protectively around his shoulders. "My mother smiled at me here," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. In that single moment, the orphan's bold promise to help Ellie walk again took on a fragile weight. The hum of hospital machinery receded, and even the air tasted heavier. Jonathan Hale watched from behind the glass partition, heart tightening. Here, the stark divide between his wealth and Luca's loss was laid bare. No amount of money could bring back Luca's parents or erase the crash that had shattered their lives. Yet here was this boy, offering hope instead of bitterness. Luca folded the photograph and handed it to Ellie. She accepted it with care, her pale fingers trembling. Ellie's eyes, rimmed with tears, met Luca's briefly before tracing the lines of his family's past. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words seemed too small, but they held genuine reverence. Luca gave a small, brave grin and tucked the photo into the pocket of his faded jeans, as though safeguarding a precious relic. The head physical therapist, Marisol Vega, stepped forward. She studied the photograph, then closed her eyes for a heartbeat before slipping the picture into her own pocket. It was a silent act of solidarity that shifted the room's energy. No longer did Jonathan's pedigree or the hospital's protocols hold the most power. The lived truth embodied by Luca resonated with everyone present. Ellie took a deep breath and lifted her foot from the support frame. Luca knelt beside her, placing one hand under her knee and the other at her ankle. The brace loosened under his gentle guidance. Ellie closed her eyes and gingerly lowered her toes to the floor, flexing them as Luca instructed. Marisol's gasp broke the hush. The subtle movement spoke volumes, not of miraculous cure, but of cautious possibility. Luca's voice remained steady. "Trust the ground beneath you." He released Ellie's leg, allowing her to feel the pressure of her own weight. Ellie's toes curled into the mat, a faint quiver of life where there had been none. Jonathan's throat tightened with emotion. He had believed in medicine, in laboratories, in billing codes, and now he realized that faith itself could redeem the body. Ellie opened her eyes and met Luca's gaze. A tear slid down her cheek as she tested her balance, Then she tried again, this time pressing her foot flat and straightening her leg more fully. A murmur of astonishment drifted through the room. Carla, a junior therapist who had watched skeptically, wiped her eyes and stepped forward, nodding at Marisol in quiet approval. Just as Ellie began to show a spark of confidence, a nurse's paging chime interrupted the moment. The door slid open, and a hospital administrator in a crisp suit entered, clipboard in hand. He approached Jonathan with measured steps. "Mr. Hale, I'm afraid there's an issue with the insurance authorization for these sessions. They require board approval before any non-standard therapy." Jonathan met the administrator's cool gaze. Under his polished exterior, panic fluttered. Ellie's fragile progress hung on the thread of paperwork. If the board refused, this session and everyone to come could be halted. Luca's eyes followed the administrator, and a flicker of apprehension crossed his face. Ellie sensed the tension shift. She glanced at Jonathan, then at Luca, and finally at Marisol, whose posture conveyed solidarity. Ellie lifted a trembling hand and touched the administrator's arm. "Please," she said softly, voice steady despite her fear. "Just let me try once more." The administrator hesitated, glancing at the brace, the photograph, the hopeful lines around Ellie's eyes. After a long moment, he looked at Jonathan. "I'll file an emergency request. You have until tomorrow afternoon to secure approval." Jonathan exhaled in relief. He nodded to the administrator, who backed out of the room. The door slid shut, restoring the earlier quiet. Ellie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then shifted her weight onto her newly awakened leg. Luca steadied her, voice gentle. "We keep going." As the therapy resumed, Jonathan stood by the glass with tears unspilled, watching Luca's earnest guidance and Ellie's tentative triumph. He realized that every step she took carried the weight of both their pasts. Here, in that small room, the promise of healing stretched beyond physical recovery. It signaled a chance to confront buried guilt and bridge the chasm between privilege and pain. And as Ellie flexed her toes again, Jonathan felt the first stirrings of something he had long forgotten: belief in the possibility of redemption. Dawn arrived over Union Civic Plaza with a soft flush of pink light across the bronze fountain's still droplets. Luca Bennett stood barefoot on the cracked concrete, fitting together the wooden balance beam he had salvaged from a local carpentry workshop. The beam's surface was worn smooth by countless hands, but sturdy enough to bear Ellie Hale's weight. Jonathan Hale hovered beside him, suit crisp and dark against the pale morning, hands clenched at his sides as though bracing for impact. Ellie sat in her wheelchair, bundled in a light scarf against the chill, her eyes bright with anticipation. Spectators gathered behind temporary barricades, a handful of journalists clutching notebooks, caretakers from Denver General with clipboards, curious passers-by drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. The morning air tasted of possibility and nerves. Ellie shifted in her seat, the whir of her wheelchair's motors quiet against the distant hum of city traffic. She lifted a gloved hand to Luca, and he nodded. Luca knelt by the beam's edge and unlatched the padded harness straps. His fingers brushed Ellie's wrist as he guided her hand to the strap. She exhaled and allowed him to position her foot on the beam, the leather pad beneath her ankle flexing with the weight transfer. Luca's eyes never left hers as he whispered, "Imagine the beam as solid ground, steady and strong." Ellie closed her eyes, as though drawing strength from the beam's grain. When she opened them, they shone with a fierce determination. Luca unfastened the last strap and moved to her side. He extended his hand, palm up, offering both support and reassurance. Ellie gripped it, knuckles white, and Luca rose to stand beside her, hands steady at her waist. For a moment, nothing happened. The plaza hushed. Even the fountain seemed to suspend its drop. Then Ellie took a small, deliberate breath and lifted her free foot. She placed it on the beam with measured care. The crowd exhaled in unison, a collective intake of hope. Ellie's leg quivered, muscle trembling, but she held firm. Another breath, another step. A cheer rose like summer thunder from the spectators, erupting in applause and whispered exclamations. Jonathan felt warmth flood his eyes. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat, unwilling to let tears fall. He climbed onto the beam, careful not to startle Ellie, and reached for her free hand. His grip was gentle but unwavering. Ellie glanced at him, a hesitant smile lifting her lips, then looked back at Luca, whose own grin shone with pride. Ellie's second step was slower, more cautious, yet steadier. The beam wavered beneath her, but did not tip. Luca's voice carried across the plaza. "You're doing it." The words rang clear and true. Jonathan tightened his hold and steadied Ellie's waist with his other hand. He felt every heartbeat as though it were his own, each pulse a reminder of the fragile miracle unfolding before him. Nearby, Marisol Vega, the head physical therapist, wiped a tear from her cheek, whispering to Carla, the junior therapist, "Keep the cameras rolling." A woman in the crowd, a passerby who had earlier mocked Luca's claim, raised her phone with shaking fingers. The glow of the live stream notification illuminated her determined face. Jonathan's pulse thundered. He sensed that this moment of triumph could shift into scandal with a single misstep. Ellie lifted her free hand to wave at the crowd, and Luca offered an encouraging nod. She wasted no time, taking a third step, then a fourth, each movement deliberate and sure. The beam now felt less like a challenge and more like solid ground. Behind them, the fountain's droplets resumed their fall, catching the morning light in a cascade of tiny diamonds. When Ellie reached the end of the beam, Luca stepped forward to guide her safely back onto the concrete. Jonathan descended too, his legs unsteady on the rough surface. He pressed a hand to Ellie's shoulder as Luca released her wrist. Ellie stood for a heartbeat, silent and radiant. Then she turned to Luca and Jonathan, her eyes shining with a wonder he knew she had not felt since the accident. Applause washed over them, a tide of sound that echoed across Union Civic Plaza. Jonathan looked at Luca, realizing that belief, steadfast, unyielding belief, had carried more weight than any fortune he possessed. He squeezed Ellie's shoulder and whispered, "You did it." She nodded, voice catching. "We did it." As the crowd surged forward to congratulate them, Jonathan caught sight of the woman filming with her phone. He met her gaze and offered a small, grateful wave. Her live stream notification pinged again. In the blur of applause and flashing cameras, Jonathan sensed that hope had become something far more powerful than a fleeting moment. It was a bridge across a chasm of guilt and grief, built by a barefoot boy's promise, and somewhere in that crowded plaza, after months of silence. Ellie laughed. By midday, the pediatric wing at Denver General had transformed from a place of routine care into a whispered epicenter of hope. Nurses paused in doorways, exchanging furtive glances as they slipped past room 312. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but the air crackled with something far more charged: anticipation, curiosity, perhaps a hint of doubt ready to be erased. Marisol Vega emerged from the observation area, her clinical poise softened by a genuine warmth. She approached Jonathan Hale in the narrow corridor where the pale green walls bore the scuffs of countless passing carts. Jonathan, still in his morning suit, though the hour had grown late, turned at her approach. His eyes, usually so guarded, carried the fatigue of the sleepless nights and the tension of a man learning that cost could not measure value. "I have to admit, Mr. Hale," Marisol said quietly, voice low enough that only he could hear. "His approach isn't just hope. It's unlocking something we couldn't reach." She shifted her gaze toward the therapy room window, where Luca guided Ellie through her exercises. "I thought this would be a circus, but it's real." A soft tremor of admiration laced her words. Jonathan nodded, surprised by the depth of her conviction. He realized that loyalty could be earned not by a title or paycheck, but by respect for compassion in action. He had believed in policies and protocols. Now he saw that healing required more than procedures. It needed trust. Inside room 312, Ellie rested in her wheelchair, exhaustion and exhilaration mingling in her tired smile. Her cheeks glowed with the rush of accomplishment as Luca knelt beside her, wrapping a fresh bandage around the small abrasion on her ankle. She had pushed herself yesterday and today through uncharted territory, and her skin had paid the price. Luca's fingers moved with gentle efficiency, ensuring the wrap was snug but not constricting. Ellie watched him, eyes shining with gratitude. "She's ready for more," Luca said softly to Jonathan, voice threaded with both caution and hope. He glanced up, meeting Jonathan's gaze. In Luca's dark eyes, Jonathan saw the reflection of his own vulnerability, a man learning to put faith over fear. Jonathan swallowed hard. For years, he had dictated terms in boardrooms, convinced that authority conferred power. Now, he recognized an unexpected hierarchy in which compassion, earned through action, held sway over wealth. He squared his shoulders, as though readying himself for the confrontation he knew must come. Meanwhile, at Blake Enterprises on 15th Street, an entirely different drama unfolded. In the mahogany-paneled boardroom, the CFO paced before a row of executives, waving a tablet displaying leaked footage of Luca and Ellie at the plaza. The lawyer, from St. George and Miller, sat at the head of the table, scowling. She tapped her pen on the polished surface. "If these sessions continue without proper authorization," the lawyer warned, "the company faces not only liability, but regulatory sanctions. Our stock could plummet." She tapped the table again, eyes flicking to the CFO. "We must intervene." Behind them, a large screen showed Ellie's tentative first steps, the crowd's applause echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Jonathan understood their fear. A single misstep could trigger a lawsuit, a consumer backlash, a costly investigation. He could almost see the spreadsheets running through their minds, calculating the bottom-line damage. Then Jonathan entered. At the doorway, he paused. The executives looked up, expecting a plea for prudence. Instead, Jonathan lifted his chin and crossed the threshold without a word. The lawyer sputtered. The CFO cleared her throat, but none dared interrupt as he walked to the center of the room. Jonathan fixed each person with a steady gaze. He did not raise his voice. He did not summon charts or disclaimers. Instead, he simply said, "I will protect Luca's work, regardless of cost." His quiet resolve filled the room. The lawyer's pen stilled. The CFO folded his arms, uncertainty flickering across his face. Jonathan turned on his heel and left the boardroom, the echo of his footsteps a promise of defiance. He would face the board, the attorneys, the regulators if he must. They could threaten sanctions, withdraw funding, demand halts. But he would not waver. His daughter's recovery and this boy's gift of hope had become a cause too important to abandon. Back at Denver General, Luca guided Ellie toward the balance beam for one more exercise. Jonathan waited at the doorway, chest firm with resolve. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them. Outside, the city of Denver moved on as it always did, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding within sterile hallways. Ellie placed her foot on the beam, and Luca offered his hand. Jonathan stood at the threshold, knowing that tomorrow might bring legal battles or boardroom skirmishes. But today, they had bridged a gap far wider than any corporate divide. A boy's courage had reshaped a man's world. As Luca steadied Ellie's ankle for another step, Jonathan watched, understanding that some truths could not be negotiated. They had to be lived. That evening, Jonathan Hale arrived at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science with Ellie Hale and Luca Bennett in tow. The grand entrance hall gleamed under vaulted ceilings, where massive dinosaur skeletons loomed overhead like silent sentinels. Jonathan adjusted Ellie's wheelchair, tucking a soft velvet shawl around her shoulders against the cool air conditioning. The polished marble floors reflected the glitter of evening gowns and tuxedos, and the distant strains of a string quartet warmed the atmosphere. Luca followed quietly, his bare feet making soft thuds against the stone. His worn jeans and simple t-shirt made him stand out among the silk and satin. Yet he moved with a confidence born of purpose rather than pedigree. As they passed under a towering cast of a T-Rex skull, Ellie's eyes grew wide. She reached forward to trace the blackened rib bones, fingertips hovering as if afraid to break the ancient illusion. Luca paused beside her and pointed out the curve of the femur, explaining in gentle tones how the creature's legs had supported its massive body millions of years ago. Ellie leaned in, her laughter shy at first, then richer and louder than she had dared to speak in months. Jonathan watched them from a few steps back, conflicted. He had arranged this evening as a gesture of inclusion, proof that Ellie's recovery could transcend hospital walls. Yet he understood now that wealth could build grand events and also build walls. In this hall of prehistoric wonders, privilege felt like another exhibit behind glass. He tugged at his bow tie, contemplating the barrier that still separated Luca from the socialites gathered around champagne tables. A board member, Anne Whitaker, drifted over, her diamond necklace flickering in the light. She offered Jonathan a strained smile and extended a leather portfolio. Jonathan sensed the weight in her gesture before he opened the folder. Inside lay a crisp cease and desist letter from St. George and Miller, declaring Luca's therapy sessions an unauthorized medical practice. It threatened immediate legal action and demanded the hospital sever ties within 48 hours. Jonathan's throat tightened. He closed the portfolio and slipped it into his jacket, voice steady as he lifted his glass. To new worlds, he toasted, cold resolve under polished civility. The assembled guests clinked their glasses, though their eyes lingered on Ellie and Luca in a curious mix of admiration and disdain. Ellie raised her glass with Jonathan and Luca, her smile hesitant but sincere. Luca's grin was quick and bright, but his jaw tightened as he glanced at the letter's envelope peeking from Jonathan's pocket. The string quartet shifted into a waltz, and couples glided across the floor. Ellie's wheelchair hummed forward, carried by invisible music. She looked back at Jonathan, her voice small with excitement. "This place is beautiful." Jonathan felt the familiar ache of fatherly pride as he watched her brightness returned. He turned to Luca, who stood under the prismatic glow of crystal chandeliers, his bare arms folded in reflection. Luca's gaze drifted around the hall, absorbing the grandiosity and the hierarchies etched on every face. "Beauty is everywhere," Luca said, voice low as he joined Ellie at her side. "Once you learn to see it," he reached out to guide Ellie past a display case of trilobite fossils, their segmented shells preserved in stone. Ellie touched the glass as though connecting with a distant past, and Luca smiled at her wonder. In that moment, Jonathan realized that the greatest divide was not wealth, but imagination and the courage to reframe one's world. The orchestra swelled as the lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell, a hush that carried the echo of Luca's father's faded portrait at the children's home, the hush of despair that had once filled Ellie's hospital room. Jonathan felt a tremor pass through him, as if the ancient skeletons overhead had exhaled after centuries of silence. A sudden murmur rose from the crowd as a museum guard approached, announcing the dinner buffet was ready. Guests drifted away, their evening gowns swirling like tides. Ellie wheeled herself toward the buffet, and Luca followed, crouching so he could pass her a plate. He looked up at Jonathan and offered a small nod, a silent question. How far would he go to protect this fragile world they were building? Jonathan met Luca's eyes and saw both uncertainty and expectation mirrored there. He realized that the letter from St. George and Miller spelled out more than legal threat. It marked the boundary between two worlds he had to cross. Wealth could summon cease and desist orders. Compassion had no signature. He held the letter's weight in his pocket like a silent promise. As the hall emptied, the string quartet struck a final chord, and guests drifted toward the grand staircase. Ellie and Luca shared a quiet laugh at a display of fossilized footprints embedded in the floor, tracing the shape of ancient creatures that once roamed where now they stood in silk and marble. Jonathan watched them, understanding that bridging privileged society and barefoot courage required more than grand invitations. It demanded steadfast belief in each other's strength. He moved toward them, slipping the letter from his jacket, ready to face whatever came next. The orchestra's last note lingered in the air like a question awaiting its answer. Late one afternoon, Jonathan Hale sat alone at a heavy oak table in the law library of St. George and Miller on New York Street in Detroit. The scent of leather-bound volumes mingled with the faint hum of air conditioning. He opened a stack of depositions and accident reports bearing the name Luca Bennett, sole survivor of the Hale freight crash that had claimed 2 lives. His eyes skimmed witness testimonies describing the overturned truck, the fractured guardrail, the desperate cries in the wreckage. A cold knot formed in Jonathan's chest as he recognized corporate memos he had personally signed directives to offer hush money, to buy silence. Every settlement check, every suppressed report had been meant to bury this tragic event deep beneath the weight of company coffers. Now, reading Luca's name across those pages felt like ice spreading through his veins. Jonathan leaned forward, gloved fingers tracing Luca's witness statement. The boy had recalled his parents' last moments with heartbreaking clarity, his father's hand lifting his chin, his mother's final words of comfort. He closed his eyes, picturing Luca's earnest face at Union Civic Plaza, barefoot and hopeful. He had been more than a healer. He was a living reminder of Jonathan's worst transgressions. A tremor of guilt shook him as he shut the file with a soft thud. Meanwhile, at Denver General Hospital, Ellie Hale sat on a bench in the sunlit atrium, clutching an album of scratched photographs Luca had brought earlier. Luca knelt beside her, adjusting the pages so she could see the faces of his mother and father. Ellie studied the curved lines of his scars and asked in a small, hesitant voice, "Did you really lose your mommy and daddy in that crash?" Luca nodded, eyes distant and warm. "They were good people," he said softly. A hush fell around them as Ellie reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it on his knee. "I'm so sorry." In that tender moment, Jonathan walked in to fetch them, and he froze at the doorway. Ellie's pale cheeks bore sympathy deeper than any words, and Luca's quiet strength stood between them like a living wall. Power shifted unnervingly. Here was a boy whose loss eclipsed any privilege, whose grief compelled compassion from even the hardest heart. As they headed toward the elevator, Jonathan's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. He excused himself, his jacket falling open to reveal the crease in his suit, pressed by guilt and fear. The message from a city council aide demanded explanation for the morning's unconventional therapy sessions. It warned of inquiries into hospital protocol and civil liability. Jonathan felt a familiar tightening in his gut. He could type a curt dismissal and order Luca away from Ellie, block the boy's access to the hospital wings forever. But he looked back at Ellie's hopeful face and Luca's steady gaze, and he felt resolve harden in his chest. Instead of pressing dismiss, he slipped an arm around Ellie's shoulders and spoke softly. "We finished this together." That night, Jonathan returned to Crestwood Manor, its corridors dimly lit by recessed lamps. He paused at his study door, shoulders heavy, and let the silence of the grand hallway wash over him. On his desk lay a single unsealed envelope, ivory and creased along its flap. Ellie's name was scrawled on it in Luca's uneven handwriting. His pulse quickened as he slit the paper. Inside was a single line, written on hospital stationery in the same small, precise letters he had seen on Luca's journal. "I forgive you." His breath caught in his throat. How could a boy forgive the man responsible for the collision that took his parents' lives? The weight of his past misdeeds landed on him anew, heavier than any legal document or corporate sanction. Jonathan pressed both hands to the envelope as though it were a talisman. The house was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. He tasted regret and relief in equal measure. In Luca's forgiveness, he sensed not only grace, but a summons to atone. The legal threats and boardroom battles threatened to close every door, yet here was a child offering him the only key he truly needed, a chance to rebuild trust. He folded the note and placed it back in the envelope, his fingers steady now with purpose. Outside, a distant siren wailed through the quiet streets, its strain like a call to action. Jonathan knew that dawn would bring more challenges, council hearings, internal memos demanding his compliance, a fragile program teetering on the brink of collapse. Yet, for the first time, he felt the courage to face them, not as a corporate magnate hiding behind settlements, but as a father, determined to honor a promise of hope. He closed the desk drawer with deliberate care, leaving the envelope inside beneath a thick sheaf of reports. As he walked away, the faint glow of moonlight through the window cast elongated shadows across the polished floor, and Jonathan realized that forgiveness had unburdened him in ways he had never imagined. The next morning, Jonathan Hale steered his black sedan through the grid of Denver's Baker neighborhood. Ellie Hale sat in the back, her wheelchair folded into the trunk before they left the hospital. She watched Luca Bennett's bare feet tap nervously against the car floor. His toes curled against the mat as the cityscape passed by worn brick row houses, flowering chestnut trees, graffiti-stained alleyways. Ellie turned in her seat to study him. His cheeks were flushed with anticipation, but his dark eyes held unease. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. Jonathan kept his eyes on the road, but glanced in the rearview mirror. He imagined his daughter's battered hope taking shape in the boarded-up house that lay ahead. He had arranged for Blake Enterprises to fund its renovation and transform the old Bennett family home into the Luca Bennett Healing Center, a free community therapy space for neighborhood children. The irony was not lost on him. The site where his company's truck had shattered lives would soon become a place of rebuilding. They pulled to a stop in front of a modest craftsman house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch roof. Boards covered broken windows and a scrawled mural of a phoenix graced one side wall. A crew of construction workers in reflective vests and hard hats clustered near piles of lumber and sheets of plywood. A foreman, broad-shouldered with a red beard, waved Jonathan over. His eyes, rimmed with early morning fatigue, lit up with gratitude. "Mr. Hale, good to see you," the foreman said, extending a hand mottled with sawdust. "We've started clearing the interior and fixing up the exterior. Kids from the neighborhood have already dropped off donations, old toys, art supplies." His voice cracked with emotion. "They're calling this place the Phoenix House." Jonathan nodded, smothering the lump in his throat. He placed a firm hand on the foreman's shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "Keep me posted on any issues, large or small." As the foreman guided Jonathan to a retired schoolteacher painting over graffiti, Ellie wheeled herself forward, and Luca followed, running his hand along the weathered siding. Fingers traced grooves in the wood as if greeting an old friend. The house smelled of damp plaster and aging pine. Inside, Ellie lifted her hand to dust motes dancing in a beam of sunlight. She ran her fingertips along dusty shelves and imagined laughter echoing off the walls, music drifting through open windows, hope filling every corner. Luca watched her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He knelt to examine a crack in the plaster, as though mapping the house's scars. "This place has a story," he said, voice soft. "We'll give it a new one." Jonathan followed them room to room. In what had once been the living room, workers removed broken tiles and swept decades of debris into garbage bags. Down the hall, the kitchen lay in ruins, crumbling cabinets, a leak in the ceiling darkening the floorboards. An electrician stood on a ladder, testing wires. They would install energy-efficient lighting and a wheelchair-accessible ramp at the front entrance. Everywhere Jonathan looked, he saw not just decay, but potential. He felt the familiar weight of his corporate power shift beneath him. For the first time, his resources served more than profit; they could restore life. He overheard two neighbors leaning against a fence, whispering that Blake Enterprises' investment felt genuine, not a ploy for publicity. Their eyes met his across the yard, and he nodded in acknowledgement. His chest tightened with relief. Just as he was about to congratulate Luca on his unwavering dedication, his phone buzzed with a message from Ellie's mother, Linda Hale. He slipped away to read it. The message was curt. "Your board insists on cutting funding unless we halt Luca's methods. No negotiation, no grace." Jonathan stared at the screen, heart tearing between loyalty to his board and loyalty to the boy who had delivered hope to his daughter. He pocketed the phone and returned to the front porch. Ellie and Luca stood side by side, their silhouettes framed by the peeling doorframe. Ellie looked at him expectantly, eyes bright. Luca met Jonathan's gaze, unwavering. Jonathan forced a smile, though it felt brittle. He knelt to look Luca in the eye and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry," he said quietly. His voice was calm but firm. Ellie leaned forward, her wheels inching closer as she reached for Luca's hand. "We'll find a way." Behind them, the mural of the phoenix folded its painted wings around the house, promising rebirth. Jonathan drew in a steady breath, feeling the weight of the board's warning slip from his shoulders. His daughter's laughter echoed in his mind, and Luca's promise glowed brighter than any corporate decree. As the three of them stood on that broken porch, Jonathan understood that restitution could not be measured in dollars alone. It required action, risk, and unwavering faith in the promise of tomorrow. That night, the study at Crestwood Manor lay in muted shadows. Jonathan Hale stood beneath the soft glow of a banker's lamp, rifling through manila folders stamped Denver General Confidential, his suit jacket draped over a velvet armchair, its lining whispering against the carpet. He sifted through hospital correspondence, insurance denials, oversight memos, billing disputes, until his fingers froze on a thick envelope labeled Confidential Child Custody. The flap gaped slightly, as if waiting for discovery. He peeled it open and withdrew adoption papers bearing his own signature and the embossed seal of Denver Children's Home. The date was 3 weeks ago, signed by Jonathan in a moment of guilt-stricken resolve. He had never mentioned it to Luca Bennett. Jonathan sank into his leather chair, the aged hide creaking beneath him. His heart pounded as he spread the documents on his mahogany desk. He had intended the offer as restitution and unspoken apology, a way to give Luca a permanent place in his life after losing his parents. In the pale lamplight, the ink on the forms gleamed like a vow made but never spoken. Guilt and fear surged together. He thought of Luca's hopeful grin in the therapy room, of Ellie's quiet triumphs, and wondered whether this promise had become a burden he was too late to bear. At dawn, Jonathan parked in the lot of Denver General Hospital, the sky pale behind the city skyline. The therapy wing's atrium opened onto a courtyard framed by glass walls, where sunlight flooded in. Liam, the head nurse, sat on a low bench reading a children's book to a cluster of kids in colorful scrubs. Ellie Hale leaned against the window's ledge, her gait unsteady but determined, as she watched the story's illustrations. Luca Bennett knelt beside the last child in line, offering a gentle hand to steady her. Jonathan walked slowly across the terrazzo floor, the click of his shoes echoing. Luca looked up and caught his gaze for a heartbeat longer than usual. Ellie turned, eyes shining, as she spotted Jonathan approaching with a leather folder in hand. Liam closed the book and shushed the children with a grin, then gestured them toward doors leading back to the therapy gym. The last child skipped inside, leaving the atrium almost empty. Jonathan closed the distance. He cleared his throat. "Luca," he said, voice thick with emotion. Luca stood, hands clasped in front of him. Ellie wheeled forward, placing her hand on Jonathan's arm. He lifted the leather folder inside, lay the custody papers. Luca's eyebrows rose as Jonathan extended the envelope. Ellie gasped softly. Jonathan swallowed, voice unsteady. "You signed this," he said. The words hung in the sunlight like dust motes. Luca's fingers trembled as he took the folder, peeling back the cover to reveal the documents. His face fell, then tightened with guarded hope. Power shifted again. No longer was Luca the supplicant. Here stood a man pleading for trust. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes as she understood. She turned to Luca, voice hushed. "He wants to give you a home." Luca's jaw flexed as he scanned the papers. The words adoptive parent and legal guardian stared back at him. He swallowed hard and closed the folder. Ellie reached out to squeeze his hand, gratitude and wonder in her eyes. Before Luca could speak, the atrium doors burst open. A police lieutenant strode in, her badge glinting against the stiff fabric of her uniform. She carried a dossier under one arm and wore a look that brooked no delay. "Mr. Hale," she said, voice low but urgent. "We need a word about the Bennett Healing Center." Jonathan's chest tightened as he nodded toward the lieutenant, then glanced at Luca and Ellie. They watched him, tension and readiness on their faces. Jonathan closed the folder and slipped it into his jacket, the weight of silence settling around them. The promise in ink and the threat of inquiry stood side by side in the quiet atrium, demanding choice and courage in equal measure. Jonathan Hale walked beside Lieutenant Ramirez down the narrow corridor at Denver General Hospital, the linoleum tiles clicking under their polished shoes. The late afternoon light filtered through high windows, casting long, pale stripes across the floor. Ramirez closed the door behind her, and they entered a small, cluttered office, stacked with binders and patient files. The lieutenant's expression was solemn as she laid a row of subpoenas on the desk. Each bore the seal of the Colorado Department of Public Health. Jonathan studied the documents, the letters demanding detailed medical oversight for the Bennett Healing Center. Without official credentials, Luca's unorthodox therapy methods could be deemed unauthorized practice, leaving the center vulnerable to immediate closure and potential fines. He felt the weight settle on his shoulders, a familiar tension returning. He had pledged to shield this program and the boy who created it from every obstacle. Now the very safety he had guaranteed threatened to collapse. Ramirez tapped the files. "These require your response within 48 hours. You'll need to show proof of licensed supervision, clinical trial data, or risk the center being shut down." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. He had already arranged for legal counsel to fight any unwarranted actions, but he knew that relying on lawyers alone would betray the spirit of the community effort he had sworn to protect. He needed a foundation stronger than boardroom briefs and courtroom arguments. Meanwhile, outside the office, Ellie Hale and Luca Bennett stood in the hospital atrium, hands intertwined. Sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, painting them in warm light. Ellie's wheelchair hummed as she edged closer to Luca. Her eyes, bright with determination, met his. "We've come too far to stop," she said softly. Luca nodded, his jaw firm. He looked beyond Ellie at a small group gathering near the glass doors, children who had benefited from his sessions, parents in sneakers and sweatshirts, therapists clutching clipboards. At his side stood Marisol Vega, the head physical therapist whose initial skepticism had given way to unwavering support. Marisol held a petition scrawled with dozens of signatures families who believed in the healing center and refused to let it fade away. She raised the petition high, voice carrying over the atrium's hush. "We stand behind Luca. We demand this center remains open." The circle widened as more children and parents joined hands. Their collective resolve pulsed like a living heartbeat in the sunlit space. Jonathan emerged from Ramirez's office, face grave but determined. He paused at the entrance to the atrium and raised his voice so all could hear. "I will work with the Colorado Department of Public Health to license Luca's program. No matter what it takes, this place will stay open." A ripple of relief swept through the crowd. Children cheered softly, parents hugged one another, and therapists smiled with gratitude. Ellie leaned toward Luca, eyes shining with both relief and pride. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. Luca offered her a gentle nod, his own expression softening as hope flooded his features. But as the afternoon light dimmed and hospital corridors grew quiet, Jonathan felt the finality of his commitment. He looked at the petition in Marisol's hand, signatures gathered not by press releases or public relations, but by genuine gratitude for the small miracles Luca had unlocked. He understood that what had begun as a legal and logistical battle had become something far deeper, a movement of shared trust. Later, when the construction crews locked up the Bennett Healing Center and secure locks clicked into place, Jonathan stood at the threshold, watching the workers carry tools into waiting trucks. He felt the hush of evening settle over the renovated spaces rooms that would soon echo with laughter, determination, and quiet triumph. His gaze rested on the center's new sign, painted in bold blue letters, Bennett Healing Center. Jonathan knew the real fight had only just begun. Licensing procedures and health codes would demand exhaustive documentation and rigorous oversight. Yet beneath every form and regulation lay the irrefutable truth captured in the petition's signatures, a community's belief in the power of healing beyond medicine. And in that moment, he understood that true restoration required both legal proof and unwavering faith in one another. Late afternoon sunlight tinted the rebuilt Bennett Healing Center's lobby in honeyed gold as children trickled in for their therapy sessions. The lobby's pale walls glowed softly, and the scent of fresh paint mingled with chalk dust and the faint tang of antiseptic. Ellie Hale sat on a low bench beside Luca Bennett, studying his profile. The light caught the curve of his cheek and the determined set of his shoulders, as though carved by purpose itself. Marisol Vega appeared through the double doors, her stride purposeful as she guided a small boy clutching a crayon drawing. The boy's hair was ruffled, and his cheeks were stained with the residue of tears and crayons alike. He paused at the edge of the bench, took a deep breath, and ran toward Luca, arms outstretched. With a bright laugh, he threw himself around Luca's waist and squeezed tight. "Thanks, Dad," he announced, voice clear enough to still the room's hum. Gasps rippled through onlookers. Parents froze mid-step. Volunteers exchanged stunned glances, and therapists paused with clipboards in hand. Jonathan Hale, standing near the reception desk, felt his heart lurch in his chest. He saw Luca's gaze flick to the filing cabinets behind the desk, then shift to Jonathan's astonished face. In that longest of moments, the embrace tightened, binding past and present. Ellie's breath hitched, her eyes shining with wonder and questions she could not yet voice. Luca released the boy and knelt to ruffle his hair. His voice was warm, low enough for only the boy to hear, "You're welcome, buddy." He lifted the drawing, a crude sketch of 3 figures under a rainbow, and held it tenderly. Jonathan noticed, for the first time, the slight tremor in Luca's hands. The power dynamic in the room shifted in an instant. That single word Dad carried the weight of unspoken promises and the buried history Jonathan had desperately tried to keep hidden. The community volunteers, once skeptical, now looked at Luca not merely as a healer, but as a father figure offering acceptance and warmth. Ellie's pulse thrummed in her ears as she watched them. Gratitude glowed in her eyes, but beneath that hope, a tremor of doubt surfaced. She leaned forward, resting her hand on Luca's shoulder as though to steady both him and herself. Was Luca truly ready to embrace a family that included a father who had, by omission and by design, wronged him? Could forgiveness bridge that chasm before anyone could speak? The front doors swung open with a clatter. A television crew burst in, cameras whirring and microphones raised. A reporter's voice cut through the hush like static. "Hail, Mr. Bennett. Any comment on the allegations that this center is operating without proper medical oversight?" The children clustered around Luca, confusion and fear flickering in their eyes. Some hid behind chairs, others clung to Marisol, uncertain. Jonathan's mind raced. This morning's petition and the board's threats now seemed trivial beside the glare of live cameras and the potential scandal. Luca's carefully built world, every unorthodox method, every whispered exercise threatened to crumble under the glare of legal scrutiny and public suspicion. Jonathan swallowed, chest tightening as he recalled Luca's steady kindness and Ellie's blossoming courage. He inhaled slowly, then stepped forward, scanning the room of anxious faces. Luca rose beside him, thumb brushing the edge of the drawing as though seeking anchor. Ellie shifted in her seat, eyes fixed on the television crew. Jonathan realized he had to act not as a board chairman or a man hiding behind wealth and influence, but as a father determined to protect both his daughter and the boy who had become family. He raised his hands to calm the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, clear, and low enough to draw everyone close. "This center is about community, healing, and hope." He said, "Luca's methods have already changed lives, starting with my own daughter's. We are working with the Colorado Department of Public Health to ensure every safety measure and credential is in place. No court order, no soundbite, And no challenge, we'll close these doors while these children are learning to stand again. The cameras paused, pencils hovered above pads, and the children edged closer, sensing the shift in power. Luca looked at Jonathan, and for the first time, Jonathan saw relief and pride mingle in the boy's eyes. Ellie reached for Luca's hand, then raised her own voice in a small but confident addition. I can walk because Dad and Luca believed. Silence fell. The television crew lowered their cameras. The reporter nodded, and the children clustered around Luca and Ellie once more. In that quiet that followed the confession and the storm, Jonathan understood how fragile and yet how powerful trust could be born in truth, sustained by action, and sealed with courage. The next morning, Jonathan Hale stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Blake Enterprises headquarters on Blake Street in Denver. He passed under towering columns of polished stone and mirrored glass that reflected his tense posture from every angle. His tailored suit felt heavy, as if weighed down by the consequence of every bold choice he had made. He rode the elevator to the top floor, where framed photos of the company's history lined the hallway, one showing his grandfather shaking hands on a factory floor, another capturing the ribbon cutting at the original warehouse. Today, their legacy and his own future would face their sternest test. He entered his corner office, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline, and found the board of directors already assembled around a gleaming walnut table. Their expressions ranged from frustration to barely concealed anger, each face a testament to the wealth and power he had promised to wield responsibly. At the head of the table sat Claudia Shaw, general counsel for St. George and Miller, her posture precise, her steely gaze cutting through the air. With a clipped motion, she placed the Denver police lieutenant's subpoena and the demand letter from the Colorado Department of Public Health on the table. I appreciate your passion, Claudia began, voice measured yet cold, but your personal commitments are jeopardizing shareholder value. Yesterday's press intrusion and the child's confession have driven our stock price down and invited legal scrutiny we cannot ignore. A murmur rose around the room as she tapped the subpoena's embossed seal. One director folded her arms, lips pursed. Another shook his head in exasperation. Jonathan felt the sting of their disapproval hone his resolve. He pressed his palms flat on the polished surface, the grain of the wood pressing into his fingertips as if rooting him to the moment. He met each board member's gaze in turn. This is not a matter of profit, he said evenly. This is about saving my daughter's future and honoring a boy whose life was upended by our actions. What Luca has achieved goes beyond medicine. It reaches into the heart of community and restoration. He inhaled slowly, letting each word land. We will obtain proper licensing from the Colorado Medical Board, or we will find another path to keep the Bennett Healing Center open. Claudia's expression hardened. She leaned forward, fingertips steepled. Unless you can produce certification within 24 hours, this center must close immediately. She slid a silver pen across the table and placed it in front of him, the ballpoint glinting like a challenge. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He glanced at the pen, then at the demand letter. Behind him, a janitor paused in the doorway, mop handle clasped in both hands. The man's presence was silent, almost ghostly, like a reminder that the world beyond these walls depended on more than quarterly earnings. Jonathan recalled the faces of the parents and children waiting for Luca in the lobby of the healing center, children who could take their first steps because someone dared to believe. Real power, he realized, did not reside in legal threats or stock indices, but in the quiet hopes of those families. A director scoffed. You're asking us to gamble our investors' trust on a boy's unproven methods? That's not leadership, it's recklessness. Jonathan met the scoff with calm clarity. Leadership is taking responsibility for the consequences of your predecessor's mistakes, he said. I stand by this program because it works, and because the community stands behind it. If the board withdraws support now, I will fund it myself. A hush fell. Claudia's sharpened features softened for a fraction. Then she slid the pen closer to him. If you wish to defy the board, you will need to resign your position and fund the center personally. Otherwise, sign here to close the center by noon tomorrow. Jonathan inhaled, the city's winter air pressing against the window glass. He thought of Luca's bare feet tapping on the lobby floor as he guided Ellie, of the orphan's fatherly embrace from the children's drawing, of the petition driven by community trust. He remembered the man he had become, a father determined to repair the damage his wealth had caused. He reached for the pen, fingers curling around its cool barrel. Ellie's voice echoed in his memory. "I can walk, because Dad and Luca believed." The words warmed him from the inside. He lifted the pen, feeling its weight settle in the space between his past and future. Jonathan paused, pen poised above the paper, and looked around the table at the faces of those who measured risk in dollars alone. In that charged silence, he understood that the next stroke would define not only his legacy at Blake Enterprises, but the moral bearing of every decision to follow. His hand trembled only slightly as he prepared to sign or refuse to shape a world where healing was stronger than fear, and trust outweighed obligation. That evening, the Bennett Healing Center glowed like a lantern in the heart of Denver's Baker neighborhood. Strings of festooned lights crisscrossed above the yard where families gathered on folding chairs and picnic blankets. The center's new sign, Bennett Healing Center, hung cleanly on the refurbished porch. Its bold blue letters gleamed in the warm light, a testament to the months of sweat and determination that had transformed a broken house into a sanctuary. Children in bright t-shirts lined up on foam mats and balance beams at the edge of the lawn. Under Luca Bennett's careful direction, they stretched their arms wide and shifted weight from one foot to the other, learning to trust the ground beneath them. Jonathan Hale stood beside his daughter, Ellie, her small hand slipping into his as she steadied herself on the edge of the beam. Her gaze never left Luca's as she practiced her steps, each movement a testament to how far she had come. Parents clustered nearby, faces shining with pride and tears. Some clapped encouragement, others captured the moment on smartphones, their live stream notifications pinging gently in the background. Among them stood Marisol Vega, the head physical therapist whose journey from skeptic to champion had been as profound as any patient's recovery. She caught Jonathan's eye and raised her glass of lemonade in a silent toast. On a raised platform at the center of the yard, Jonathan stepped forward to address the gathering. His normally poised voice trembled with emotion. He cleared his throat, drawing a hush over the crowd. The scent of pine and evening air mingled with the low hum of cicadas. "Today," he began, "we stand not as a billionaire or a barefoot orphan, but as a community bound by trust and healing." A ripple of applause rose from the audience. He glanced at Luca, whose calm smile steadied him. "We have faced legal threats, public doubt, and the weight of our past mistakes. Yet here, we have also witnessed miracles born of courage and collective belief." He handed the microphone to Luca, who stepped forward barefoot, each toe gripping the wooden platform, as though charting its own path. The applause softened as Luca met the crowd's gaze, voice soft but unwavering. "Someone once told me that believing could change everything," he said. His words drifted across the yard, finding each listener. Ellie believed I could help her walk again. Today, because she believed, many more will walk forward with confidence. He gestured to the children, now moving confidently along the foam mats and beams. Their laughter and tentative cheers filled the night air. Ellie, still perched on the balance beam beside her father, let out a small cheer and tapped her foot in rhythm. Jonathan gripped her hand, his own eyes misting. The couple at the front, who had once doubted Luca's methods, stood now cheering the loudest. A community board member, whose earlier legal demands had threatened to shutter the center, raised her voice above the applause. "You have changed Denver's future," she declared, one step at a time. Behind them, a group of reporters edged forward, local news cameras rolling as flashbulbs popped like distant fireflies. The reporter from yesterday's press scramble raised her microphone. "Mr. Hale, Mr. Bennett, what comes next for this center?" she asked. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Luca, whose eyes shone with determination, even in the glare of the lenses. He stepped back to the microphone, Ellie's small hand still in his, and replied, "Next, we build on this trust. We train more volunteers, certify our program, and welcome every child who needs a chance. This center is not an end in itself, but the spark for a network of healing one that spreads beyond these walls into every corner of our city. As he spoke, the parents nodded, the children smiled, and Luca stood beside him, a place of honor earned through barefoot steps and boundless faith. When the final exercise ended, Ellie allowed herself to descend from the beam without Luca's guiding hand, her own steps sure and steady. The crowd held its breath as she touched the ground. Then cheers erupted in a tidal wave of joy and relief. Parents embraced, children skipped and danced, and even the reporters set aside their notebooks to clap. Jonathan felt his heart swell with a profound understanding. Victory would not be measured by courtroom approvals or stock valuations. It would be counted in every step Ellie took, every child who trusted the ground beneath their feet, and every bond forged by the simple act of believing in one another. The Healing Center's mission had crystallized under the festival lights, not as a monument to a single institution, but as a living testament to people restoring one another through courage, compassion, and unwavering belief. Dawn broke over the Bennett Healing Center's courtyard, painting the repaired brick walls in soft apricot hues. The early light glimmered on the dew-speckled grass and traced long shadows behind a row of young aspen trees. Jonathan Hale entered the courtyard ahead of his daughter and Luca, his breath visible in the cool morning air despite the promise of another warm Denver day. He found them already at the balance beam, its surface now smooth from countless footsteps. The faded blue paint worn down to the wood at its center. Ellie Hale stood alone on the beam, eyes closed, arms relaxed at her sides. She inhaled deeply, the quiet of the rising sun surrounding her like a lullaby. A single chip of wood lay at her feet, where years of splinters had been sanded away. She took a moment before opening her eyes and turning toward Luca. He knelt beside her, offering a steadying hand, but letting her stand unassisted. Then she looked toward her father. Jonathan watched the scene in silent awe. No cameras, no reporters, just the three of them in a space they had shaped together. He saw the steadiness in Ellie's stance and the trust in Luca's expression. The years of therapy sessions, boardroom battles, and community petitions had led to this moment of quiet triumph. Ellie took a deliberate step forward, rolling her foot to meet the beam's edge. Her movement was measured, each muscle cooperating as if awakening from slumber. Another step followed, toes curling slightly around the wood for grip. Jonathan felt tears blur the edges of his vision. She walked on the beam toward him, each inch a testament to courage and belief. When she reached Jonathan's side, he knelt and gathered her into his arms. His suit jacket rustled against the gravel beneath his knees. Ellie buried her face in his shoulder, her small frame trembling with emotion. "I did it," she whispered. Jonathan pressed his cheek to her hair and murmured, "I'm so proud of you." His voice wavered as he held on to her. Ellie pulled back just enough to grin at him, her eyes shining with laughter and new confidence. Luca watched them, chest swelling with something stronger than hope belonging. Jonathan released Ellie's hand and reached for Luca's. Their palms met in a firm grip, the silent history of trial and reconciliation bound in that single touch. Luca's warm smile spoke of forgiveness earned and a future reclaimed. Jonathan led them toward the grove of aspens planted months earlier, each sapling a promise of growth. The newly sprouted leaves trembled in the breeze, casting dancing patterns of light on the gravel path. Ahead lay a simple wooden bench engraved with three names: Ellie, Luca, Jonathan. They seated themselves together in the fading glow of dawn. Ellie sat between the two men, her father to her left and Luca to her right, their shoulders touching as if to form an unbroken line. No flourish of fanfare, just three silhouettes against the morning sky. A folded piece of paper slipped from Luca's pocket and fluttered to the ground. Ellie reached down to pick it up, unfolding the paper. The words were scrawled in Luca's precise handwriting. "Sometimes, the real miracle isn't walking again, it's believing you were never broken." Ellie handed the note to Jonathan, who read it aloud in a hushed tone. He paused on the final phrase, his gaze sweeping between Ellie and Luca. Jonathan looked at both children, his heart aching with gratitude. He had once believed that power lay in money and influence, Now he knew true power lived in trust and compassion. Ellie leaned against him, and Luca draped an arm around both of them, forming a quiet embrace that needed no words. In that serene moment, the courtyard held its breath. The aspens shimmered in the gentle breeze, the first birds began to call, and the center they had built stood firm behind them. They sat in silence, 3 lives irrevocably changed, standing together as one. No grand gestures were needed. Their presence spoke volumes. As the sun rose higher, casting gold across the courtyard, Jonathan rose and offered his hand to Ellie. She took it, stepping down from the bench. Luca stood as well, his bare feet touching the cool gravel at their feet. Together, they walked away from the bench and toward the center's front doors, each step a declaration of unity and renewal. They walked toward tomorrow not as separate worlds divided by wealth or loss, but as a single family bonded by courage, redemption, and unwavering belief in one another. The sun had long set, but the soft glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the quiet sidewalk. Luca sat on the steps of the center, his eyes lost in thought. In the distance, a few children still played, their laughter spilling into the night air. For a moment, it was easy to forget the weight of the world pressing on them. Healing, he had learned, wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about learning how to live with them, how to move forward, despite them. Maybe that's where the real strength lay, not in perfection, but in the willingness to keep going, together, and in the soft hum of the evening. Luca couldn't help but wonder how many of us are waiting for someone to show up, even when the world feels too broken to fix.